Hi there, my name is Mel Hopper-Koppelman. I am Executive Director of Evidence-Based Acupuncture, and welcome to this week's exciting episode, hopefully, of To The Point, hosted by the American Acupuncture Council. And thank you very much to them for presenting this for all of us to learn from. So today I want to share with you, I think it's been very exciting for us as a profession, which is an opportunity to perhaps explain a lot of things about how acupuncture works that as a profession we often have trouble explaining. So let's take a look at the presentation. I want to start by saying, though, I'm not suggesting that this is the right way to look at how acupuncture works or the only way, but I think it's the evidence for this pathway is very compelling, and I think it's helpful because it's one that explains quite a bit of all the magic that happens between administering acupuncture and people getting better from a wide variety of illnesses. And in particular, not that we want to do everything around those who are skeptical of our medicine, but this material really speaks to two big arguments that are often proposed by skeptics. One of them is that acupuncture lacks biological plausibility, so there's no reason why it should work. And the second, which I think that if we really think about it, we can all relate to, particularly if we put ourselves in the shoes that we were in before we ever had acupuncture or never thought about it, is that we claim that we can treat everything from migraines to mental health issues like depression to fertility to all sorts of things, pain. And how is it possible that administering acupuncture and inserting small needles can do all of these things? And so I think that this scientific evidence is going to help us quite a bit in explaining how that's even possible. So first, just so we're kind of in the right mindset, I want to give a very brief history of what's going on with neurotransmitters and acupuncture. So most of us are going to be familiar with the two parts of our autonomic or automatic nervous system. We've got the fight or flight nervous system, which is going to help us run away from the tiger, and we've got the rest and digest and relax part of our nervous system, which helps us digest our food, have a good immune response, balances our hormones, and so on. So the fight or flight system is mainly happening with the help of neurotransmitters that, like adrenaline. We're familiar with that adrenaline rush, and then the yin to the yang for the rest and digest is acetylcholine. So we've got this sort of yin yang pair, and we may be familiar with this type of image. So here we can see the fight or flight on the left and the rest and digest on the right, and how it has these opposing effects on the different organs. And so for a really long time, it was thought that that was the whole story for the autonomic nervous system, that we simply had these two parts, and that was how it worked. But relatively recently, I'd say, in the 60s and very much by the early 70s, a very intelligent gentleman by the name of Geoffrey Bernstock, he was able to discover actually a new nervous system signal that was neither one of those. So what he did with the help of his furry friend was that he blocked both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, but a signal still got through. And so it seemed that there was something else going on. And so with continual study, he found that it was something called purines that were carrying this signal. And so we called it purinergic signaling. So you might see that if you are so inspired to look at any literature around this, that's the term that's going to be used. And we're going to keep this very simple. All a purine is a chemical component that has those two rings together. So that's what we mean when we say purine. And in particular, what Geoffrey Bernstock had discovered was these two main purines that you might have heard of were what was carrying this signal. So we've got ATP, which is short for adenosine triphosphate, and its partner, it's another yin-yang pair, adenosine. So ATP, you might know as the energy currency in the body. And then when it breaks down, it loses its phosphate groups. Then we've got adenosine. And so when we talk about purinergic signaling, we're talking about both of these together because, as I say, it's very much a yin-yang pair, as is all of biochemistry. So when we see one, we see the other. So he proposed this firmly in 1972. It was met with resistance until the 90s, which, almost all of us can remember. That's very recently. And then finally, when scientists were able to isolate the receptors for these, then there was acceptance of his theory. And it's now established that every single nerve uses ATP as a co-transmitter. So it's not just there, it's extremely important. In terms of, we're about to go into some of the evidence for how this is related to how acupuncture works. But one of the things that I think makes it a good candidate is that in this paper, we see that ATP and purinergic signaling is one of the most primitive and ancient and conserved forms of communication in living animals, well preceding the development of the nervous system. So as soon as we see life on the planet Earth, we see purinergic signaling. So if we're looking for something very fundamental to being alive, then this seems to be kind of a helpful candidate. So what is purinergic signaling then? So for any signal in the body, there's roughly these three stages. There's the release of the signal, there's the reception of the signal, and then there's inactivation. I tend to think of like if you make a phone call. So you make a phone call, you release the signal, and now it's ringing. Somebody answers it, and so it's been received. And then hopefully, if they answer it, the phone stops ringing because that would be irritating, and that's the inactivation of the signal. So then what makes ATP and adenosine release? Well, here's a list. So some common things are mechanical deformation, like when we move and exercise, or when, thinking about massage. Shear stress. So think about blood going through blood vessels would be this type of shear stress. Heat, stretch, swelling, deficient oxygen, and damaged and dying cells. So the top of that list is all sort of normal and healthy things. And then the bottom is when we have tissue damage or things are going wrong. So this is a signal that's used both when we're healthy and just in the background, and also when we're having a problem. So hopefully, as you look at this list, you kind of see some familiar things. So things like acupuncture, moxa, and tuina certainly elicit many of these purinergic signaling initiators. And so here's a really close-up picture. This is of a probe, which to me looks quite a lot like an acupuncture needle, going into some tissue. And as we go from top and then left to right, and then as time goes on, those little red dots that we see increasing are molecules of ATP. So you can directly see that when this probe goes in, this ATP is released. And from this same study, this is looking at what happens when we stretch tissue. So again, we are seeing what's happening over time as this tissue is stretched, in this case, about 20%. And these beautiful rainbow clouds popping up are the release of ATP. So that's how it's released, but then the signal needs to be received by some sort of receptor. And there's actually quite a lot of different receptors for ATP and adenosine, which is actually similar for a lot of neurotransmitters in the body. And you can kind of think of this as if you ring a phone, and then depending on who answers, it's going to really impact what kind of conversation you have, or it's going to impact the result. And that's the same thing for these receptors. So for example, there are anti-inflammatory receptors for these molecules, and there's pro-inflammatory. Some of them are involved in acute pain, some of them are involved in chronic pain. But what's particularly interesting about these is that they're present in all tissues and all body systems, which is uncommon because most of the time we have a high level of specialization in our body. So then the signal's received, and then we need this inactivation, which happens through this very yin-yang-like process where ATP is converted into adenosine, and then it's converted back. So a good question at this time might be, what does this have to do with acupuncture? And hopefully already that's quite clear. So again, Geoffrey Bernstock, being a very out-of-the-box thinker and very smart dude, in 2009, he thought, wait a minute, I wonder if this is how acupuncture works. And so he proposed something like this, that when we insert acupuncture needles, the poking and stretching by the needles or the application of heat by moxa releases a lot of ATP. And then the ATP binds to receptors. And then this transmits a signal to the brain and nervous system. And then the brainstem and hypothalamus in the brains are going to control these autonomic functions like cardiovascular system, GI, respiratory, all the things that we say that we help. And what's beautiful about this explanation is he hasn't used the word chi or magic fairy dust once. So this is a little schematic of what that might look like. And it's what I like about it, again, because it's not about having discovered the right answer, but what is this an answer that gives a specific and positive enough image to perhaps our medical colleagues about what's going on, to dispel doubts about whether or not acupuncture has biological plausibility. And I feel strongly that it might. So after this was proposed as a theory in 2010, a group of researchers actually tested this on mice, and they found that if they blocked adenosine, then there was no pain relieving effect from acupuncture. So they found that acupuncture increased adenosine levels by 24-fold, and that if adenosine receptors weren't there, that there was no pain relief from the treatment. And so the authors write that although acupuncture has been practiced for over 4,000 years, which might be a little bit of an overstatement, it has been difficult to establish its biological basis. Our findings indicate that adenosine is central to the mechanistic actions of acupuncture. But so this was in mice, so it was a little bit speculative, but then fortunately it was repeated in humans. And so in 2012, a study was done, and they looked at stomach 36, and they found that adenosine increased significantly. And in a control point that was not an acupuncture point, adenosine did not release. And also that they found that needle rotation was required, which was quite interesting. And so they found that, they said that our results indicate that acupuncture triggers adenosine release in humans comparable to that previously observed in mice. And interestingly, acupuncture needle placement in a non-acupuncture point in equal distance to the probe did not trigger increases in local adenosine concentration. So they're demonstrating point specificity, which is really interesting. Now, this is a study. This is looking at the world's favorite purine, which is caffeine. This study, when presented, sometimes elicits some strong emotions because we all like our coffee. This isn't actually coffee. This is I drink my coffee out of this. But caffeine is also a purine, and so they found that it did interfere with the pain relieving effects of acupuncture in mice. So certainly a preliminary study and one that's food for thought. So you can see the similar structure there. And so, there's a lot of different biochemistry that's involved in acupuncture. It's not just about one thing, but it really appears that that this signaling might be the first domino that knocks over the rest, from needle insertion and mechanical stimulation, that then we have ATP and adenosine, and to some extent histamine, and then these other ones might follow later. So this was a very recent study, less than a year old, that was looking at this. And so they actually blocked every single different part in different combinations to see what is the critical factor from a biochemical perspective in acupuncture needling. And what they found is that if they increased adenosine, then the treatment was enhanced. If they blocked adenosine, then the treatment was blocked. They found that histamine is involved as well, but not to the same extent. So I think that histamine's working with adenosine, but this ATP and adenosine is a very interesting model for us to look at. So this is the kind of dominoes, that ATP and adenosine may be that first domino after needle insertion that helps us achieve our effects. So looking just briefly clinically, so what clinical areas does this affect? So one thing that to know is that, as I alluded to before, this signaling is unique in that it's in its pluripotency and omnipresence. That means that because it's all powerful and it's everywhere, and that's just not how most biochemistry in our bodies works. So it's really quite interesting. And they write in the review, most transmitter systems are anatomically segregated, having a preferential manifestation in certain systems and tissues. But in contrast, ATP and adenosine are produced and released by cells in all tissues. And most cells, no matter how different they are and how they express, they express these receptors for purines. And so therefore, purines contribute to a wide variety of physiological functions. Which is cool. And so, I found this really exciting, and kind of wondering, how kind of mainstream conventional or pharma thought about this. And then I came across this review published in the Trends in Pharmacological Sciences, and Barea et al. Write, adenosine as a multi-signaling guardian angel in human diseases. When, where, and how does it exert its protective effects? Which I thought, this is, so, it's real. They're aware of it. They write that the importance of adenosine for human health cannot be overstated. Indeed, this ubiquitous nucleoside is an integral component of ATP and regulates the function of every tissue and organ in the body. So this is coming from the pharmaceutical literature. So we know it's highly relevant in pain. And as I mentioned before, there are different types of pain receptors that are doing different things, everything from acute pain, chronic pain, nerve injury, neuropathic pain. All different receptors are mediating this response, and they're receptors for adenosine. Headache and migraine, adenosine is key to signaling in headache. So this review found that clinical evidence found that adenosine signal plays a critical role in migraine headache, and that also there's a particular receptor that they've identified as well. So it's so it's central, and we know how good we are at treating headaches and migraines. And interestingly, because as we know, headaches and migraines can have lots of different triggers. There can be food triggers, there can be stress triggers, there can be smells, all that sort of thing. And this review found that adenosine is involved as a unifying mediator of all of these. So it's sort of in the center of a lot of things going on, which is interesting. This study was just pointing out that people who have a certain expression of this receptor gene are more likely to get migraine with aura, which again shows that the two are connected. It's evolved in the immune system, and actually this paper really made me laugh. So this is by these researchers. They write extracellular ATP and adenosine, the yin and yang in immune responses. And I immediately Googled them, and I'm like, are these Chinese medical practitioners? And I don't think they are. I think they just could see. And what they were pointing out was that depending on whether ATP or adenosine was binding to an immune cell, it completely changed how it expressed. And if it's involved in the immune system, it's involved in cancer. So this is looking at targeting adenosine in immunotherapy. And what they found was actually that not only does adenosine play a key role, and that it's this disturbance of this balance between ATP and adenosine that can lead to disease, but they also show that adenosine and ATP are the critical step before tissue turns into a tumor. So it's not, it's not just related. It's central. It's involved in the health of the cardiovascular system, and again, all of these different tissues have these receptors. In terms of how contracted our vascular system is, how our heart, all of our blood cells are all responding to this system. And this is a little diagram showing that this is, I think, this is how the brain knows and the heart knows, according to this model, of course, how to contract, when to contract, and so on. It's definitely involved in the gut, and I would say that it's this signaling that lets us know when we're full, or when we get a tummy ache, or all that stuff. That's what that signal is getting to the brain from ATP and adenosine. So in summary, this is quite exciting, because again, I kind of really want to make sure that I'm saying this. This is just from one perspective. It's a biochemical perspective, and it's certainly a simplification. There are a lot of different things that are involved in what we do, physiologically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and of course, according to our models, which are very robust. But I want to put this forward as a an explanation and a system that really, I feel like it fits well with our understanding of the human body, and also serves as a model that's really mapping out from needling to kind of profound, diverse physiological effect in a way that we can explain clearly. This is so much more clear and known than, for example, what we, how Tylenol, paracetamol work. That's relatively unknown, and here we can point to a pathway showing all the steps. So, in summary, if we want to sum this pathway up, we could say that acupuncture needling triggers the release of ATP and adenosine, and these bind to nerve receptors that send the signal to the brain, to the spinal cord, and in the brainstem, then it's going to alter that function. So that's regulating our cardiovascular system, our heart rate, our breathing, our digestion. And then in the higher brain centers, this also modulates how we experience pain. And then this starts a cascade of biochemical events that, it's not just acupuncturists or acupuncture researchers who have observed these. This is also the pharmaceutical industry has observed these as well, and is developing drugs to try to block these or enhance these, which are going to be challenging because, as we've said, it's all about balance, isn't it? And it's tricky to find that balance through a drug, whereas it's quite elegant to find that balance through a mechanical signal like acupuncture. And so then, I think that this explanation could be said to remove doubts about biological plausibility, and it explains how acupuncture can be clinically helpful for such a diverse range of clinical areas. So this was a very whistle-stop tour on this subject. I did on this if you're interested, and I'm happy to let you know where to get that if you want to learn more. But I really hope that you enjoyed that, and that you found it helpful and beneficial, and that hopefully it's something that you might be able to use if you think that it makes sense. So thank you for that, and please tune in at the same time next week. We're going to have Tony Cheng here talking about some really interesting things as well. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you to the AAC for the opportunity, and be well. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.